Ladies and gentlemen, let's begin into the video. We're going to be discussing Nintendo and a recent patent which many are assuming is going to be part and parcel of the Nintendo NX. So this patent is actually pretty weird because it's very, very different for a method of control than a traditional controller, but potentially could replicate much of the uses and much more besides. It basically is talking about attaching an accessory. For example, it could be a physical button, or it could potentially be something along the lines of a variant of an analog stick, or a dozen other things, we'll go into that in a second, to the side of a portable device. And then an infrared camera will register those button presses by means of a reflective surface. Traditionally, if you were to open up a controller, for example the PS4 controller, or even an arcade stick, it's an electrical current which is formed when you press a button. For example, if you were to open up a SNES controller, there is a circuit board, and when you press the button, for example, let's say you press Y on the controller, the connection is formed and it registers that you've pressed the medium punch button or whatever you've got mapped on that particular controller with that particular game. And that, of course, is down to the software to interpret that the machine has given, or rather you have given the machine the signal that you have pressed the Y button, and therefore then the software interprets that. Now, to understand how this works, it's very important to realize that the attachments themselves are with no circuitry from what I can understand. They are pretty much hollow, so you could almost think of them as like a Lego brick. And if that helps you think of the best way I can describe this is like one of the old child toys building blocks, you know, the massive ones, the like, you know, for 2 and up kind of thing. Imagine that where inside is a reflective surface, and imagine that the building block buttons, the top bits where you plug another block on, they are pressable. That's the best way I can describe this if you need a visual aid. However, there is no internal circuits on that. So, for all intents and purposes, you could manufacture devices pretty cheaply, so you could do some pretty interesting stuff, theoretically. Now, what the limits of this are, for example, how many buttons it could register, that would be the infrared camera, we don't know. And there are going to be some obvious questions. For example, does it measure the distance accurately, and what is the refresh rate for this, and how does that convey to, let's say, traditional analog control? So obviously a traditional analog controller has a finite amount of sensitivity. So if you were to use a machine, if you were to strap the controller down onto a table and you were to use a machine to very, 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 very accurately slowly press up on the controller, there would be a certain number of levels, if you will. So, for example, older controllers might have 256 input levels of force that you can apply to the controller that it would register, which were traditionally used for, let's say, racing games or anything else. How that conveys to a camera, we don't know, and also what the refresh rate of that camera, for example, the actual frame rate of that camera would be. Now, the higher the refresh rate is of the camera, in other words, the more times it's taking a snapshot of what you're doing, theoretically means the higher the sensitivity of the device that you're using. It's not necessarily that important if you're playing something along the lines of Mario, but theoretically if you were to use I don't know, analog stick in certain situations, conceivably it could be quite important. But the biggest reason that sensitivity might make a difference is because you would be able to actually, in theory, if this pattern is accurate, you would be able to use the device for so much more. From what I can understand, and obviously it's a patent, so at the end of the day you're kind of making guesses based upon rumours and the patent itself. I don't have a working NX prototype on my desk, unfortunately, but from what I can gather, it would appear that the camera would function without a plastic device, and therefore it could conceivably monitor your gestures of your hands or whatever else. So it's a bloody weird idea. I don't hate it because I don't think there's enough information for me to hate. It's like, it's conceivably, it's actually quite a genius idea, because it conceivably means that you could have controllers specific for certain situations or for certain applications that, presumably, as long as the developers themselves, so for example, whether that would be anyone from Konami, Capcom, whoever's actually developing for the NX, create the appropriate gestures recognized on the camera, it should be an interesting situation, because specific controllers created for that game could be quite cheap to produce, and they could release dozens of them. They could bundle them in with the game, and you wouldn't really need these elegant and expensive solutions. How it works in reality and what use it is, whether it turns out to be like, it's, you know, it's cool, but everyone just goes with the standard controller, we don't know. And how the standard controller even functions with this type of system. And the biggest problem is if it bolts on, and I know that's a bit of an inelegant way of putting it, but if it bolts on, the issue I've got is it could be kind of big. But I guess it depends, because obviously the images they're showing are for illustrative purposes only. They're probably not indicative of the final design, and even if they were, because we can't see the final design, it's not something that we're able to hold. It's not even like a 3D print, it's not like a 3D model. It's like, even if it is, how does it feel in the hand? So it's kind of weird. For example, and I know this is going back a bit, but when I first, and I was very young at the time, when I first saw the, the N64 controller, I was like, don't know about that, that doesn't look comfortable. But when I used it, I was like, oh, okay, I kind of understand. Because at the time, I was so used to the Genesis, or the Mega Drive if you prefer, controller, which, by the way, I also thought to myself, that looks kind of big. I don't know if it's going to be comfortable when I'm holding it in my hand. But yeah, I really like the Genesis controller, and when I used the N64 controller, the first thought I had was, don't know about this, don't I need access to the D-pad, the analog stick, and everything else? So how am I going to be able to hold that, touch both the trigger buttons? And I just couldn't wrap my mind around it, because obviously I'd not used it. So you can have an idea of how it feels in your hand and how it controls, but the reality was very different. So I'm not going to judge this, I'm not going to go down on it, I'm not going to, you know, smash it from orbit until I've actually played on the damn thing. But anyway, it's quite interesting. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.